My ex-wife, Lisa, was a classmate of mine. At the reunion, she spotted me in my work clothes, hurled insults at me, and then doused me with beer. Unable to tolerate her terrible attitude, I left the venue, and right in front of me was a sleek black luxury car, a symbol of my successful life restart after our divorce. My name is Tom Harris. I grew up in an average household, and am an utterly ordinary guy with an unremarkable personality, the kind you'd find anywhere. Raised in a normal family, I've lived a standard life. During my student days, I had a fair share of friends and led a pretty standard school life, devoid of any dramatic events. The maxim that I, an ordinary guy, always keep in mind comes from Mr. Johnson, my high school teacher. It's possible to overcome any difficulty. Live with perseverance. This phrase has always been with me, supporting me through everything. Thankfully, I haven't yet encountered a situation that made me desperately rely on these words, but I always make sure to remember them. As a nondescript student, I secretly admired my classmate, Lisa. Her constantly changing expressions, attentive way of listening to people, and occasionally feminine side profile were incredibly attractive to me. When we coincidentally ended up at the same university, I fancifully thought it was fate. Despite being such an inconspicuous student, I've always harbored a secret admiration for my classmate, Lisa. In contrast, I was just another face in the crowd, to the extent that some of my peers didn't even know my name. Yet, sometimes when the conversation turned to our high school days, Lisa would talk to me, and those small interactions made me incredibly happy. Such trivial things brought me joy, and that alone was enough to make me feel content. I was such a modest man. Nevertheless, by the time I graduated from college, I wanted to know where I stood. It was a long unrequited love since high school, and if there was no hope, it was better to give up and move on. Now was the chance. With a resolve of potentially facing rejection, I confessed to Lisa. Yes, okay. Her unexpected reply made me wonder if I was dreaming. My days with Lisa, whom I'd long admired, were truly blissful. I've always tried to gift Lisa with whatever she desired. I worked hard, motivated by the joy of seeing her happy smile when she received my gifts. Our relationship progressed smoothly, and in my third year as a working professional, I proposed. Wanting to fulfill Lisa's wish to be a housewife, I worked harder than ever. Though it was challenging to manage the expenses of two people in my third year, my desire to make Lisa happy drove me to work diligently. Thankfully, my efforts paid off, and I managed an unusual career advancement, surpassing my colleagues and seniors. Employed by a major corporation, my salary was already above average, but with the promotion, I started earning an enviable amount. However, as my income increased, so did Lisa's frivolous spending in the name of self-improvement. While it wasn't threatening our livelihood yet, the seasonal brand bags and new clothes for every meal with friends added up. Each time I thought to speak up, seeing her happy made me hold back, thinking, if I work harder, it'll be fine. Looking back, I regret that my attitude might have contributed to her becoming careless. One day, during lunch break, I was having a coffee and chatting with my colleague, Susan. Suddenly, an internal email popped up on every employee's computer. Susan, who opened the email first, muttered, "No way," in disbelief. What I saw on her screen was shocking news. Due to poor company performance, a massive downsizing was announced. The email coldly listed the names of those to be laid off. As I anxiously scrolled through the list, both Susan's and my names appeared as those being laid off. I nearly dropped my coffee, feeling as if the world had gone dark around me. The employees on the list were all in their early 30s, contributors to the company in their own right. Including Susan and me, several of us approached President Smith to protest. However, President Smith said, We targeted you because you're young and have ample opportunities for re-employment. I'm sorry, but please understand our situation." He apologized deeply with a polite tone, but there was no emotion in his words. It seemed like he was just apologizing to get through the situation. That's all it seemed to me. We realized arguing with President Smith was futile and had no choice but to accept the layoff. "What will you do now?" Susan asked quietly. "I haven't decided anything yet. I need to talk it over with my wife." "What about you, Susan? What are you planning to do?" "While packing up my personal items around my desk," I asked Susan. "I think I might go back to my parents' place," she replied. "Your dad runs his own company, right? So you'll have something to fall back on for now." Speaking in as a cheerful tone as possible, she said, "Yeah, that's right," unaware at the time that Susan's voice was on the verge of tears. On my way home, I pondered what to do next. First, I thought about how to break the news to Lisa. I had worked so hard. Surely, she would understand. Even if I couldn't find another job right away, Lisa would surely support me. I had severance pay, so I could use that while looking for work. Reassured by these thoughts, I quickened my pace home, feeling slightly more optimistic. As soon as I got home and muttered about being laid off, Lisa gasped, "What? No way," turning pale. I understood her reaction. It was only natural to be anxious. "It's tough, but let's work through this together," I began. But before I could finish, Lisa looked straight at me and said, "Let's get divorced." What? I was stunned. "If you don't have a job lined up, then we should get divorced. A man without a job, who can't spend money on me, is worthless. I don't need you," Lisa spat out. Everything went dark before my eyes. I couldn't find the words to argue back as Lisa bombarded me with cruel words. "I married you thinking we'd have financial freedom with your job at a major company. My calculations were wrong." These words echoed in my ears. In the end, Lisa had never loved me from the start. She knew I had admired her since high school and assumed that with my job at a major company, there would eventually be financial stability. She thought she could eventually have the freedom to do as she pleased. I found myself wondering if this is what they mean by love cooling in an instant, even after 100 years. It felt surreal, almost like it was happening to someone else. Watching the woman ranting before me, I even questioned whether she was truly the woman I had married. As Lisa continued to list her grievances, I felt a growing revulsion and said, "All right, let's get divorced." I couldn't settle my emotions or start job hunting until the divorce was finalized. Finally divorced, I began searching for work in earnest. Though I knew it was a tough job market, I hadn't expected it to be this hard to find work, given my smooth career until then. Initially, I looked for jobs where I could use the skills I had developed in my previous role, but nothing came up. Despite having some savings, the urgency to find a new job soon began to set in. As my applications were repeatedly rejected, I realized I couldn't be choosy and started applying for jobs in fields where I had no experience. Although I believed I had average physical strength, I wasn't part of an athletic club, so I still tried to avoid jobs that required heavy labor. However, I ended up interviewing for some labor-intensive roles, and one company's president, Mr. Williams, was very kind. He listened intently to my story of being laid off. "It'll be tough at first, but we'll support you fully. Why don't you work with us?" he offered. By then, I was ready to accept any job offer. The job was mainly office work, but being a construction company, it involved some physical labor. Nobody blamed me for being less strong or slower than others, and I was grateful for everyone's support. I wasn't repaying a favor, but I used my skills to the fullest, making improvements within the company. Thanks to that, I gained trust from Mr. Williams and my colleagues. I felt truly fortunate to have joined this company. Just as I was getting comfortable with my job, I received a notice for a high school reunion. Unpleasant memories resurfaced. I didn't want to see Lisa's face again. But I did want to see Mr. Johnson, my former teacher. After some thought, I decided to attend the reunion. I was getting ready to leave when an unexpected work call came in. Without hesitation, I quickly changed into my work clothes and headed to the job site. It took longer than expected, and by the time I arrived at the reunion, it had already started. I had brought a change of clothes but decided to go in my work attire. Greeting familiar faces, I looked for Mr. Johnson but learned he was hospitalized. If Mr. Johnson isn't here, there's no point in staying. Maybe I should leave early, I thought. Just then, I heard a voice I didn't want to hear, cooing, "Oh, isn't that Tom?" It was Lisa, who had become even more flamboyant, or rather, more vulgar, than before. Beside her stood Ethan, rumored to be a fast-tracked elite. Watching Lisa look up at Ethan with a flirtatious gaze, I instantly knew he was her next mark, and Ethan didn't seem to mind. Lisa, dressed to the nines in luxury brands, and Ethan, in his elite-looking suit, glanced over me from head to toe and burst into laughter, clearly mocking my attire in work clothes. They were mocking me for wearing work clothes. "What's the matter? Is that the only outfit you have for such a grand reunion?" Just as one would expect from a man who got laid off for being incompetent, Lisa said, with a vulgar laugh. "Really, Tom, have some pride, even if you're laid off. Walking around like this. It's just embarrassing to think we went to school with someone at rock bottom," Ethan added with a smirk. Just as I thought Ethan and Lisa were nodding in agreement, Lisa suddenly poured the beer she was holding over my head. "Ah, that outfit suits you just right, you loser," she exclaimed. "Why don't you just leave? You are ruining the vibe here." "I don't have time to mingle with poor folks," he said disdainfully, as both of them looked down on me with contempt. It seemed they didn't even notice how everyone around us was taken aback by their behavior. They probably thought I felt out of place in my work clothes. Pitying them, and not wanting to spoil the atmosphere for others, I decided to leave. "I get it, I'll leave," I said and headed for the door. The classmates around me chimed in, "You don't have to leave. You should stay longer since you've come all this way. And don't worry about those two." I didn't want to spend another moment in the presence of those two, standing in the center of the venue with their smug smiles and arms crossed, looking at me. I told my friends I'd catch up with you guys later and opened the door to leave. That's when a sleek, black luxury car pulled up. The appearance of a luxury car outside the restaurant caused quite a stir inside. Naturally, Lisa and Ethan made their way through the crowd, eager to get the best view of the car. Calculating as ever, Lisa was eager to find out who the car belonged to. Then, the chauffeur stepped out and said, "President Harris, your car is ready," saying politely. I could feel the atmosphere behind me freeze. "President Harris," Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. I glanced briefly at the two of them, then entered the car where Susan was waiting. I whispered in Lisa's ear, making sure no one else could hear, "Looks like Ethan's company is in trouble. You might want to start looking for your next guy soon." Then I slipped past the motionless Lisa and got into the car. "Hi, how was your day?" Susan greeted me with a smile as I climbed into the car. "It was okay." I let out a sigh, relaxing my shoulders as I answered. In fact, my new job turned out to be at Susan's family's company, by sheer coincidence. Which meant that the kind Mr. Williams, who had been so supportive, was actually Susan's father. He had appreciated my earnestness and diligence and had made me vice president. Susan and I had confessed our feelings for each other. We found comfort and ease in our shared history, and before I knew it, we were a couple. Mr. Williams, more than anyone else, was happy for us. Susan and I were even planning our wedding soon. I had learned about Ethan's company during my business dealings. Although it was a major company, there were persistent rumors of financial irregularities, and it seemed an investigation was imminent. Whether or not the rumors were true, a company with such a reputation wasn't a good business partner. It was clear that Ethan was heading into rough waters. As I looked out the window, I thought about who Lisa would latch onto next, remembering her scornful laughter. "They'll be fine," Susan assured me. "People like that always find a way to survive." I had to agree with her. Soon, we arrived at the hospital where Mr. Johnson was staying. He greeted me warmly, a bit frailer but with the same kind smile. "Wow, Tom, you've got a real man's look now." He grinned at me with a cheerful smile. "Mr. Johnson, I've always held on to the words you told me back then. I've followed your teachings, and now, I'm truly happy in both my personal and professional life. Thank you so much." As I reported this, Mr. Johnson smiled warmly, looking at Susan and me, and I deeply felt how fortunate I was to have such a wonderful mentor. Half a year after that tumultuous reunion, Susan and I happily tied the knot. At the company, I'm being rigorously yet kindly groomed by my father-in-law, the current president, as a successor. There's still much for me to learn, but I believe I'm living the most fulfilling days of my life right now. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I hadn't dared to switch industries back then, or if Lisa had stayed with me after I was laid off. But it's precisely because of that layoff and divorce that I have my current happiness. Those times were tough and embarrassing, but I'm here today because I persevered. There's no obstacle that can't be overcome, just as Mr. Johnson said. I never gave up, found what I could do, and worked hard at it. There will surely be more challenges ahead, but I'll continue to strive step by step, never arrogant or despairing, holding Mr. Johnson's words close to my heart. For Susan, who supported me, and for myself. Why did you think you could use this hotel? Your name isn't even on the reservation. An old geezer like you would be better suited to the old motel next door. Just use that. I was thrown these words by my boss, who is over a decade younger than me. At first, I couldn't comprehend what he was talking about. But knowing him, these words didn't feel out of place. However, it was only when things started to get worse that I truly felt the weight of those words. My name is George Smith. This year, I turned 52. I've been working at my current company for about 30 years. It's a consulting firm for small and medium-sized enterprises, and I am just an ordinary employee. I didn't join with any grand ambitions. I simply liked the work of supporting people and companies and felt it suited my nature. I live with just my wife and have led a life unconnected to promotions. As for me, I find happiness in a situation where my wife can do what she wants, how she wants. The company I work for isn't a large corporation. It falls under the category of small to medium-sized enterprises. We have just over 40 employees, creating a rather homely atmosphere. In my department, including myself, we are a team of 6, managing operations in a small group. The head of our department is a calm individual, just a year older than me, and we often engage in various discussions. The other members, although younger than me, interact with me warmly, much like a beloved uncle in the family. I genuinely think it's a comfortable environment, but such tranquil times are often disrupted by trivial incidents. One day, as usual, I arrived at work to find an unfamiliar young man sprawled in the seat of our department head. The previous head, who had been there until yesterday, was nowhere to be seen. For the time being, I decided to sit at my usual desk, but it seemed like the other members were also unaware of the situation, feeling somewhat restless. When the morning meeting started, the young man at the head's desk moved next to Mr. Johnson, the company president, and was introduced. His name is Michael Green. At 40, he is a decade younger than me. His suit seemed rather high-end, just from its appearance. When Michael was introduced by Mr. Johnson, he stepped forward, surveyed the room, and spoke briefly. I am here to reform this company. I've come to seek newness and create a better role model. We will revamp anything outdated. So I look forward to working with all of you." It appeared that the previous head had been transferred to another department. It was a sudden personnel change, and we hadn't even had the chance to say goodbye. Being a small company, I thought there would be another opportunity to talk. However, I soon realized how wrong I was, just an hour after Michael's introduction. From the very first meeting, Michael began to criticize the existing methods and practices of our department. "Why are these documents printed on paper? Wouldn't electronic communication be more cost-effective and easier for information sharing? Is all contract communication done on paper? It's feasible to carry documents for local enterprises, but what about distant ones? Apply for electronic signatures and make them official for the company. A consulting firm that cannot utilize IT tools is bound to be left behind. I'll be leading the training, so please attend." It was unbearable to have everything we had worked on changed by someone who had just arrived. I decided to voice my opinion. "I appreciate your input, Michael, but most of the companies we've contracted with are based on the scale of company and informational assets. Focusing on human resource and sales material, changing everything on our end could significantly affect our clients." "That's the problem with old-timers," Michael muttered loud enough for others to hear. I felt slightly irritated. However, Michael, standing before me, seemed oblivious to such nuances in people's emotions. Unfazed, he repeated my statement. "Are you Mr. Smith? What factors are essential for branding our consulting business?" "Can't answer. That's lamentable. Listen, consulting is a business that shapes the future of companies. How can you consult without being aware of what many companies are currently adopting? Sticking to old ways will leave you behind. Change your mindset. Adapt to the times. Turn your everyday routine into something extraordinary." Hearing him, it seemed like he wanted to say that his words should be our top priority from now on. A different type of personnel than we've ever had, but it was a mystery why Mr. Johnson hired Michael as a mid-career recruit with a position. Mr. Johnson often says that building a company is all about recruiting and nurturing talent, which is essential for the company's success. However, this personnel decision seems to contradict his words a bit. It might be that Mr. Johnson's attitude when he's watching is different from the one he shows to employees like us. No, I'm certain it is different. Ever since Michael announced his plans for reform at the meeting, every day has been a torment for me. The company not only made significant changes to our previous operations, but also organized a so-called training session outside of working hours, which turned out to be a showcase of self-praise. Furthermore, it's now up to each sales representative to communicate these changes in contracts and data to our clients. Michael would nonsensically ask, why does he have to be the one to tell them? It should be us who haven't kept up with the times to do this. Michael frequently uses terms like outdated and old-fashioned. It seems he considers himself at the forefront of innovation. Naturally, he wouldn't leave older employees or those nearing retirement untouched. I don't consider myself overly prideful. But even I have things I've cultivated over time, like relationships with our clients. Yet, Michael even attempts to negate these. "Mr. Smith, your methods are inefficient. We need to shift to a more cost-effective and high-return approach. Specifically, change your sales methods like this." What he suggested was the complete opposite of everything I had worked on. I explained the background and the company's long-standing practices, but Michael, now the head, simply scoffed and refused to listen to me. His behavior didn't stop there. It became increasingly harassment-like. He made us record our sales calls and tele-appointments and submit them. Later, he'd call me in and lecture me for hours on what was wrong with my sales approach. Many employees, drained of the will to resist, accepted this ordeal in silence, hoping it would end if they didn't object. Initially, I thought of adopting the same approach but found it impossible to accept. That must have unamused Michael. His attitude towards me worsened day by day. When calling me, he would shout, "Hey," and I heard he was referring to me as that old fossil, that nuisance, behind my back. Whenever Michael entertained company visitors, he invariably assigned me to do miscellaneous matters. He would then mock me, pointing out, "You see, there are roles in work, and when you get old, this is what suits you best." The visitors could only offer awkward smiles and didn't continue the conversation, but Michael seemed thoroughly pleased with himself. I couldn't understand why he was so intent on attacking those older than him. Amidst all this, I was drowning in daily stress, but I still had my wife. I thought as long as she and I could maintain a decent life, I could get through this. That was when it happened. The company decided to organize an employee trip for bonding purposes. We were going to a fairly well-known hot spring town by bus. The hotel seemed more suited to younger people, but it also had open-air baths and cuisine that our age group would appreciate. I was excited to relax for a change. I told my wife I was leaving and set off for the meeting place at the station. It was only a few hundred meters away, a nice bit of exercise. My carry-on bag wasn't heavy, so it wasn't too tiring. The weather was clear and refreshing. I arrived at the meeting place. I was about 30 minutes early. Looking around, I saw no other employees, so I decided to enter a nearby cafe. The cafe was air-conditioned and comfortable. I ordered an iced coffee and enjoyed it at my table. A good day off. I hoped the employee trip would turn out well. But 5 minutes before the meeting time, not a single person had shown up. Thinking something was wrong, I called several colleagues. However, no one answered my calls. Eventually, I decided to call Michael. I really didn't want to, but I felt that not calling him in such a situation would lead to more trouble later. After several rings, I heard my superior's voice, tinged with laughter. "You're late. We've already left. You should catch up using a bus or taxi." With that, he hung up. I checked the email I had received. The time and meeting place were correct. The sender was Michael. I couldn't tell if he had intentionally sent me the wrong information. Despite my previous excitement, I decided to go to the hotel by connecting buses, not wanting to let the other employees down. I arrived at the hotel. It took about 3 hours. If I had taken the bus, it would have been just 40 or 50 minutes. Entering the hotel's entrance, I saw Michael standing there. An insidious smile on his face. He pointed at my bag and blurted out, "Why did you think you could use this hotel? Your name isn't even on the reservation. A geezer like you belongs in the rundown inn next door. Go use that." What is he talking about? Before I could process his words, Michael snatched my luggage and left it outside the entrance, pointing to the inn next door. "Come on, get moving." This was nothing short of bullying. I never expected to be treated like this, especially by someone younger. I was stunned, but exhaustion from the bus ride sapped my will to retaliate, so I moved to the adjacent inn without protest. Michael's laughter echoed behind me. At the inn, the landlady personally attended to me. She kindly carried my luggage and showed me around the inn. Despite its slightly worn appearance, the interior was well maintained and comfortable. Upon reaching my room, the landlady said, "Please relax," and left. Eager to wash off the sweat, I headed to the large public bath. It was quaint, a bit old-fashioned, but to my liking. The inn featured a sauna and an open-air bath, satisfying the basic elements of a hot spring. Returning to my room, I found dinner served by the waitress. The meal, using local produce, included warm dishes and a small, thick steak, all very satisfying. While enjoying my meal, the landlady came to check on me. I shared my appreciation, and she smiled, thanking me. Feeling somewhat better, I decided to share my day's experience with her. I avoided mentioning the hotel reservation but talked about the bus. The landlady listened sympathetically, without any criticism, showing concern for me. Feeling somewhat uplifted, I decided to share some stories about my everyday life. Talking about living with my wife and how she always has the upper hand, the landlady laughed a bit louder than before. "Mr. Smith, you say you're henpecked, but you speak so kindly. You must cherish your wife a lot. I'm sure she wishes for you to be more proactive," she remarked. After more pleasant conversation, she left the room. I then went for a walk outside, thinking it would be a good post-dinner exercise. The night breeze felt pleasant. It was quiet with few people around, creating a serene atmosphere. I came across a park and decided to sit on a bench there. While sitting, I reflected on recent events and the conversation I had with the landlady earlier. Suddenly, I sensed someone's presence and turned around to find Mr. Johnson, the company president, behind me. Mr. Johnson, noticing me, approached with his carry-on luggage. Originally, he was on a business trip and planned to join us afterward. Mr. Johnson and I sat on the bench and had a long, relaxed conversation. We reminisced fondly as our conversation flowed naturally. Mr. Johnson had a habit of going to a secluded park to think whenever he faced troubles. I had a similar habit, and once we had coincidentally met in the same park. Back then, I casually listened to his worries and made an offhand comment. It was something I said without much thought, but it turned out to be a word of salvation for Mr. Johnson, helping him resolve his dilemma. There was this new employee who had approached a client company for a business deal but had done so without sufficient sales preparation. Apparently, he used some inappropriate language during the visit, which upset the person in charge at the client's end. I wondered why a new employee was sent alone on such an important task. The client, a significant corporation, even considered terminating their contract with us, a concern that reached Mr. Johnson. Though Mr. Johnson was guiding the internal team and strategizing for the future, he hadn't found a satisfactory solution. Around that time, I was dealing with my own issues and often went for night walks. It usually lasts about 30 minutes, so my wife wasn't overly worried. One evening, while sitting on a bench in a nearby park, I recognized a familiar face on the next bench. It was Mr. Johnson. We were both surprised to meet each other unexpectedly, as we lived nearby but were unaware of it. Our expressions conveyed mutual understanding of each other's troubles. When I initiated the conversation with Mr. Johnson, he shared the problem about the new employee. I voiced my thoughts, though I can't recall exactly what I said. But it resonated with Mr. Johnson, and fortunately, the situation improved afterward. This shared habit and past experience remained a secret between us, never discussed with anyone else. It had been a while since Mr. Johnson and I had time to talk, so this encounter was a pleasant surprise. As the night deepened, Mr. Johnson prepared to head back to the hotel. Noticing me walking in a different direction, he called out that I am going the wrong way. But I informed him that I was staying at a different hotel. Upon hearing my story, Mr. Johnson became furious, questioning why such a thing happened and what Michael was thinking. He immediately called Michael, demanding he come to us right away. When a pale-faced Michael arrived, Mr. Johnson reprimanded him sternly. He continued, expressing that the company's achievements that Michael had praised during his interview were all thanks to me, and it was unacceptable to treat someone like me with such disregard. After sending Michael home, Mr. Johnson offered to have me stay at the original hotel. However, I chose to return to the inn, where the landlady and staff had treated me well. Mr. Johnson smiled at my decision, saying it was typical of me, and headed to the hotel. After the trip, Michael was demoted. To reforge his character, He was sent to work at a partner company known for its strict management, where he was subjected to a dormitory life and strict discipline from the matron. Though it was sad to imagine a grown man being disciplined, I couldn't help but feel it was necessary. Later, Mr. Johnson appointed me as the leader of a new project. Although I have been content with a supporting role, I accepted the leadership position, inspired by Mr. Johnson and the landlady's words. The project turned out to be a great success. Enjoying the experience of leading, I became open to more challenges. My wife noticed the change in me, complimenting my happier demeanor. We even visited the inn together, where the landlady welcomed us warmly, much to my wife's delight. With both my work and personal life flourishing, I resolved to continue striving for happiness. Anyone who works overtime and is slow at their job is just incompetent and should be fired. After that, a problem arose. Who's in charge here? He got fired yesterday. He was the only one who could speak French. What? There was only one person who could solve the problem. Michael tried to call him back, but my name is Brandon, and I'm 30 years old. Despite being in my 30s, I live a brilliant life as a bachelor. My family home, where my parents and brother live, is about an hour drive away. We have a good family relationship, and I visit home about once a month. I work in sales, and I've been with my current company for 6 years. When I first joined, there was so much to learn that I struggled every day. At one point, I was recognized for smoothly handling a client who only spoke French, and I became in charge of foreign clients. It seemed I was the only one in the office who could speak French at a native level, so naturally, my workload increased. Before I knew it, working overtime had become the norm for me. Although physically exhausting, I could keep going because my colleague Jason and others would help out, bring me snacks, and cheer me on. There's nothing I can do to help. I'm sorry you have to bear all this burden. Some coworkers apologized, showing concern for me. The workload was immense, but I felt blessed with good relationships. Knowing that my efforts were helping my colleagues gave me more motivation. In the end, I actually liked my job. One day, as usual, I was working overtime when my manager Michael came to me. "You're working late every day. Don't tell me you're doing it on purpose to increase your overtime pay." Michael was a bit of an eccentric, and even his colleagues tended to keep their distance from him. It was always a bit of a hassle to deal with him. I wouldn't do that. It's just that I have so many calls to make that I can't finish during regular hours. When I said that, Michael frowned. "Do you know what that's called? Incompetence," he said, snorting in a condescending manner. If I could, I'd love to go home on time and just relax. But my workload was double that of other employees. Additionally, some clients were in different time zones, and it would be rude not to call them during their daytime hours. So, working overtime was inevitable to manage my workload. "I'm sorry, but to avoid causing trouble to other employees' work, please let me continue a bit longer." I apologized politely, and Michael left with a click of his tongue. I wondered what Michael was doing so late, but then remembered I was in the middle of work and resumed. The next day. "Thanks to you, the documents for today's presentation will be ready just in time. Always grateful to you. Brandon, I heard that the presentation you did the other day went well. Great job." Other employees would thank me like this every day. Just hearing words of thanks and praise made all the hard work feel worthwhile. I'm honored to be of help. With such positive feedback, I was able to start my workday with great motivation. I wanted to thank everyone else as much as they thanked me. "Then, you should leave on time once in a while. I know you have a lot of work, but remember that taking breaks is also part of the job," said Jason. Heeding his advice, I decided to leave early for once. Thinking of going home early, I sent a text message to my parents. "Can I come over today? I'm getting off work on time for a change." The reply came quicker than expected. "Of course, it's been a while, so I'll cook your favorite dishes and wait for you." Thinking of having a delicious meal instead of a ready-made one tonight made me even more motivated, and I was able to focus more than usual on my work. I thought I had done enough to not trouble anyone, and when I looked at the clock, it was just past the regular closing time. Quickly preparing to leave, I greeted the remaining employees and was about to exit the company when Michael stopped me. "Leaving now? You always work late, don't you?" His usual sarcastic tone. "Yes, I've finished the minimum required tasks for today, so I'll be leaving now." I responded with a smile, not letting Michael's sarcasm bother me. However, Michael didn't seem amused. "Who said you could leave?" As he said this, I heard the sound of papers falling and turned around to see Michael had knocked all the documents off my desk. "Oops, my bad. Seems like my hand slipped." Looking at Michael's face, he was grinning, and it was obvious he did it on purpose. "Oopsie, I accidentally stepped on them." Picked them up quickly. He deliberately stepped on the fallen documents and left with a loud, crude laugh. I was genuinely worried and quickly started picking up the papers. Employees who had witnessed the whole thing helped me, and we managed to gather all the documents, but it was clear they needed sorting as various papers were mixed up. "We'll handle this, Brandon. Just go home." "Man, Michael is so immature." My colleagues, concerned for me, urged me to leave, but there were too many documents, and they would end up working overtime. "Thanks, but I'm fine. I'll do it and go home. You all have other work, right?" I said with a smile, but they insisted on helping, and thanks to them, we finished much faster than expected. However, when I checked the time, it was already 2 hours past the regular closing time, and I had several worried messages from my mom. I hadn't noticed because my phone was in my bag. "Sorry, work suddenly got busy, and it's late. I'll drop by on my next day off. I'm really sorry, especially after you prepared dinner." I sighed with regret as I messaged back. "It's okay as long as you're safe. I was worried something had happened. Come by any time." Reading my mom's reply, I felt a bit calmer and headed home. After the overtime incident, Michael seemed to have targeted me, and his childish harassment continued for a while. I was ordered to redo documents for being unclear and was the only one not receiving company emails. His blatant harassment led to my colleagues often stepping in to help, but the mental strain and stress were gradually building up. With the additional workload and Michael's harassment, I often worked until the last train. Then, one day, while working overtime alone, Michael came again. By now, Michael was a figure of caution for me, and I felt myself tense up. "What is it? What do you mean? What is it? How dare you talk to me like that?" His usual condescending tone. I have grown used to this kind of talk. "Do you even realize how incompetent you are? Just scraping off overtime pay." "I apologize. I'll leave now, then." As I started to prepare to leave, Michael said with a laugh, "No, there's no need for you to come back. What? Anyone who stays late and is slow at their job is just incompetent and should be fired." Suddenly confronted with this, I stood there, unable to grasp the meaning of Michael's words. "What do you mean?" I managed to speak, my voice strained, and Michael laughed as if pleased. "I mean, incompetents are a nuisance. You don't have to come back. You're fired. Don't make me say it again." Michael left the company with a loud, unpleasant laugh. "I'm fired. Left alone," I muttered to myself, unheard by anyone. After sitting dazed in the office for a while, I realized I had missed the last train and had to take a taxi home. As I looked out of the car window, I thought about the tasks I had to do tomorrow. Tomorrow, I need to prepare the contract for ABC Corporation, and the presentation documents too. I have to stay late tomorrow. so I can miss the last train? Is it an occupational habit? Without realizing, I started organizing my tasks for the next day in my head. Then it hit me. Oh, that's right. I got fired. I muttered, looking at the moon, and the taxi driver asked me to repeat. It's nothing, I replied with a forced smile and got out of the taxi at my house. I was so drained that I just collapsed onto my bed as soon as I got home. I was so mentally exhausted that, unusually, I woke up before my alarm clock went off. I usually get up at 7 a.m., but it was only 5 a.m. when I checked the time. I tried to go back to sleep, but Michael's words, "You are fired," kept echoing in my ears, preventing me from sleeping. I knew I had to start looking for a new job, but it wasn't easy to just move on, so I just lay there under the covers as time passed. How much time had passed? I realized my phone had been ringing continuously. I picked up the phone and saw it was a colleague. But I didn't feel like answering. I gently placed the phone back down. It was past 10 a.m. when I checked the time. I hadn't noticed it was bright outside as the curtains were closed. I wondered what my colleagues thought about me being fired. Were they angry? Were some of them happy? Was I as incompetent as Michael had said? The incident had broken my spirit, and I could only think negatively. I had been so devoted to my job, more than I realized. Even when I was a newbie, running around to the point of nearly breaking down mentally, I had never felt this low. Ding dong. Lost in my thoughts, I was startled by the sudden ringing of the doorbell. Who could it be? I slowly got up and peered through the door's peephole, and saw it was my father. I was momentarily surprised and hesitated to open the door. Then the doorbell rang again. With trembling hands, I slowly opened the door, and my father smiled upon seeing my face. What kind of face is that? At those words, tears started flowing, and before I knew it, they were streaming down my face. I'm coming in. Saying that, my father entered, holding a plastic bag. Seeing me in my wrinkled suit, he lifted the bag he was holding. Want to eat? You probably haven't eaten anything, right? So my father knew. I felt so pathetic. He entered the room and opened the curtains immediately. Perhaps it was because I had been in a dark room for a while. The sunlight felt unusually bright, perhaps brighter than usual. The company called. They said you weren't answering your phone, so they contacted our home. What happened? I explained the whole situation to my father. He listened, nodding along as I spoke. So, what do you want to do now? Asked by my father. I was unable to gather my thoughts and could only hang my head. What should I do now? What should I be thinking? How should I act? Seeing me like this, my father began to speak. Don't deny yourself just because others do. What's important is not what you should do, but what you want to do. People's words can sometimes be sharper than a blade, right? But don't let such people mislead you about your own worth. Nobody can truly determine another person's value. You've done well. Stand tall and be proud. Hearing my father's words, I found myself crying again. My father patted my back reassuringly. Let's have some food. It's your mom's cooking. If we don't eat, I'll get scolded by her. The thought made me chuckle a little. I had finally managed to smile. I ate the meal prepared by my mother with my father. Her cooking was as delicious as ever. I had lost my appetite since yesterday, but once I started eating, I was surprised at how hungry I actually was. Hunger doesn't let the mind focus forward. For now, just eat well and rest. Things will surely look up. I never thought that at this age, I would be comforted by my father. Perhaps, age doesn't matter in a family. If my father hadn't come, I would probably still be in bed. Not eating, not moving, just spiraling in negative thoughts. Feeling full helped me start looking forward again. After finishing the meal, my father said, "You can always come back home," and then he left my place. Sitting on my bed after he left, I began to think about the future. Even if I was as incompetent as Michael said, I wasn't satisfied with how things ended. I don't demand recognition for my hard work, but I refuse to believe that everything I did was in vain. After all, it was Michael who announced my dismissal. What would Mr. Johnson think about this? It felt unsatisfying to just leave things as they were, acknowledging Michael's actions. I wanted to retaliate, even if in a small way. While I was thinking, my phone rang again. Looking at the display, it was another colleague. After hesitating, I decided to answer. "Hello." As soon as I answered, I heard my colleague's loud voice. "Finally, you answered. You got fired. What's going on?" Exactly what I wanted to know. I told my colleague about last night's incident with Michael. "What? That's crazy, Michael. You should have talked back." Strangely, my colleague was indignant on my behalf. It was a bit amusing to see him angry for me, but it also felt touching. I asked my colleague what happened at the office today and how the employees were reacting. His story wandered a bit, but the gist of it was this. In the morning assembly, a few employees noticed my absence and were discussing contacting me when Michael overheard and laughed, saying I was fired. When asked why, he refused to say, citing it as personal information. What kind of personal information is that? My colleagues and superiors, suspecting unfair dismissal due to Michael's involvement, planned to consult Mr. Johnson, but he was on a business trip. They decided to speak with Mr. Johnson as soon as he returned from his trip, but many were concerned about me and had tried calling. "I was about to go to your house if you didn't respond even by tomorrow." Hearing the story from my colleague, I realized again how fortunate I was with my workplace relationships. "Thank you, I'm glad to hear it." As I said this, my colleague panicked, misunderstanding my tone. "What's with that ominous remark? You're not thinking of doing something drastic, are you?" I couldn't help but laugh at his words. "It's not funny. Seriously, what are you going to do now?" "Right. What am I going to do?" Regarding my dismissal, I need to understand the company's stance, so talking to Mr. Johnson is essential. But I didn't want to let Michael have the last word. While thinking, something occurred to me. What's happening with my workload? Yesterday, I left work without finishing my tasks. There were documents I was supposed to use today. I feel irresponsible, but I'm curious to know what happened. Well, actually, I wanted to talk to you about that too. The documents we were supposed to use today, you had mostly prepared them, right? All that was left was the detailed part of the contract translation into French. Other employees were trying to complete it. But then Michael suddenly said, "I'll do it." Hearing this, I was surprised. Because Michael was known for pushing work onto others but never doing it himself. So, Michael ended up doing it. It was finished just in time, and we hurriedly sent it to the client by email. But remember that time when Michael did a translation and it was a mess? We were also worried. Previously, Michael had claimed, "I can handle French," and prepared a contract in French, but it resulted in a complaint from the client. This was before I joined the team, so I hadn't seen it myself, but long-standing employees told me it was a big issue. And that worry became a reality. What? My colleague explained what happened today. It seems something like this happened. "Michael, there's a call from a foreign company. I could only catch your name, but couldn't understand the rest. Sorry. Should I transfer the call to you? Come on, learn to speak French. Just transfer it." Michael answered a call and said in poor French, "Hi, I'm Michael. How are you?" One more time, again. Is that even real French? Why angry? Contract, what? Sorry. Hello. He spoke in what seemed to be French, but then he said, they hung up. What did they say? Oh, they said they wanted to contract. No problem. That's definitely a lie. Later, another call came in, and an employee who understood a bit of French responded. The client was furious, saying the contract was so poorly done it was unacceptable, as if we were picking a fight. That contract had been prepared by Michael in French. Who's in charge of this? Get them to solve it. He got fired yesterday. He was the only one who could speak French. What? I sighed after hearing my colleague's explanation. I hadn't seen the contents of the contract, but the fact that they're so upset is proof that it must have been pretty shoddy. And Michael's handling of it just made things worse. It feels like pouring gasoline on the fire. It must have been tough. I'm sorry. It was my job. I couldn't think of anything else to say. I wondered if there was anything I could do, but then I remembered I was no longer in a position to be involved. I realized my dismissal was causing trouble for my colleagues. I was plagued with guilt. It's not your fault, Brandon. Your workload was already too much. It's our responsibility too for not being able to support you. Actually, isn't Michael to blame? I felt comforted by my colleague's words and found myself wanting to return to the company. Even if I decide to leave, I still want to talk to Mr. Johnson. According to my colleague, Mr. Johnson will be back from his trip in 2 days. I decided to prepare what I would discuss with him. For now, I needed to collect my belongings from the office, so I informed my colleague that I would be coming by tomorrow. He said he would let the supervisor know, and we ended the call. The next day, I went to the company to get my things. Despite being familiar with the route from years of commuting, I felt nervous today. When I arrived at the company, my colleagues gathered around, showing their concern for me. Jason said, "I'm sorry I couldn't be of help," looking frustrated. I told him that it wasn't his fault and assured my colleagues that I was fine. When I mentioned I came to collect my belongings, their expressions turned complex. They seriously considered if there was any way for me to return, showing that they valued my presence. While talking, Michael approached and looked displeased upon seeing me. "Why are you here? This area is restricted to authorized personnel only." "I just came to collect my belongings that I left here. I'll be leaving soon." As I headed towards my desk, Michael loudly called out from behind. "Good timing. Take responsibility for your work before you leave." I turned around at that line. Could he be trying to pin yesterday's incident on me? "What do you mean?" As I asked, Michael smirked. "Your half-finished contract caused an uproar with a foreign client. Take responsibility." Michael, oblivious to the appalled expressions around him, continued to blame me. I wondered how far he would go to cause trouble. Just as my anger was reaching its limit. "Enough already." A familiar voice spoke, and I turned to see Mr. Johnson standing there. Mr. Johnson. The employees were also surprised to see him. He was supposed to return from his business trip tomorrow. Michael visibly panicked at Mr. Johnson's appearance. "Mr. Johnson, you were scheduled to return tomorrow." Watching Michael speak with agitation, Mr. Johnson sighed. "I came back early after hearing about the trouble. So, what's all this commotion about?" Mr. Johnson's anger was evident to everyone. Understandably, the employees fell silent, making the office quiet. Even though I was fired, I had wanted to talk to Mr. Johnson. I thought this might be the perfect opportunity, but it didn't seem like the right time to speak up. Shouldn't the commotion be explained and guidance sought? But perhaps, as someone who's been fired, it wasn't my place to say anything. Amid the loud ticking of the clock, Mr. Johnson spoke again. "What's this commotion about? Tell me, Michael." Michael became even more unsettled when he was called out by name. However, with a sly smirk, as if having thought of something, Michael began to explain to Mr. Johnson. "This guy here, he made a sloppy contract that led to a complaint from a foreign client. I was just lecturing him about it. He always works late. and I thought maybe he was doing it on purpose to increase his overtime pay, so I fired him yesterday. I told him to take responsibility for this mess before he quits. Michael presented himself as if he were doing the right thing. I felt a renewed contempt for him, realizing once again how self-centered he was. Although I didn't want to be attacked by Mr. Johnson, it might be an opportunity to explain my side. If he didn't believe me, it could be a valid reason for leaving. Just as I was about to take a gamble and speak up, Mr. Johnson intervened. "Is that so? Then, Brandon, come to my office." Suddenly, I was filled with tension. But this gave me an opportunity to have a private conversation with Mr. Johnson. Looking at Mr. Johnson, his face was no longer stern but had a gentle smile. "Yes." I left my belongings on the desk and followed Mr. Johnson into his office. "It serves him right. This will save me." Upon entering the president's office, Mr. Johnson opened the window. A silent pressure weighed in the air, creating an atmosphere that made it difficult for me to speak. I waited for Mr. Johnson to say something first. I wondered if I was going to be reprimanded, bombarded with questions, or possibly even faced with discussions about damages or compensation. The atmosphere and tension led me to think the worst. It's a story from about 20 years ago, before this company was founded. Back then, I worked at a regular corporation. I exclaimed, surprised by the unexpected start of his story. Seeing Mr. Johnson's face, it was no longer the intimidating look from before, but a gentle smile. "I was about your age back then. I was struggling with work, no matter how hard I tried, disliked by my boss, and on the verge of giving up. That's when a senior colleague told me, 'Don't let anyone else's disapproval bring you down. You're doing great. Stand tall and be proud.'" I was struck by Mr. Johnson's words. They sounded so familiar. "Those words," I murmured. Mr. Johnson laughed heartily. "How's your dad doing?" I was stunned. Could it be that Mr. Johnson and my father know each other? I had never heard about this. I was so surprised that I couldn't speak, but Mr. Johnson continued. "Your father's words inspired me to persevere and eventually establish this company. In a way, he's my benefactor. When you joined the company, your father contacted me, asking me to look after his son. I didn't reveal our connection to prevent you from becoming complacent or feeling pressured. I hope you understand." Before I knew it, Mr. Johnson's kind words had eased my tension, and I felt a sense of happiness. I realized I had been watched over all this time. "Yes, thank you so much." As I said that, Mr. Johnson gave me a warm smile. "About the recent matter, I reviewed the documents and contract you sent to the client on my way back to the office. It was clearly made by someone else, so I know you weren't the cause. And about Michael firing you, I won't let that happen. If you're willing, I want you to continue working with us. What do you say?" It seemed like Mr. Johnson had seen right through what I wanted to discuss. I respected the insight of someone at the top of the company. "Of course, please let me keep working here. Maybe I'm simple-minded." Feeling relieved brought back my confidence. I was truly happy to continue working here. "That's a good response. I apologize for making you feel anxious and uncomfortable. It was not my intention." Mr. Johnson apologized. I was flustered and surprised. It wasn't Mr. Johnson's fault. I knew that and had no complaints against him. "I never wanted you to apologize. Sorry." I apologized reflexively, and Mr. Johnson chuckled. "Why are you apologizing? You haven't done anything wrong. I've heard about your good work. I want you here not because of my debt to your father, but because you're a capable employee. Please understand that." I learned how much being acknowledged can bring happiness and confidence. My eyes welled up with tears, perhaps because of the emotional strain. Mr. Johnson said I could leave, and I exited his office. When I stepped out, all eyes were on me. It seemed I had caused quite a worry. I smiled and gave a thumbs up, and my colleagues cheered with joy. A coworker patted my shoulder, saying they were glad for me. My tears were slightly visible, and when they teased me about crying, I retorted that I wasn't. I was smiling when suddenly I heard yelling. No way! Amidst the excitement, Michael stood with wide eyes and an angry expression. How is this possible? Are you staying? What about your responsibility? In the overtime pay, I decided you were fired. Michael's fury was no longer a threat to me. Ignoring him felt easier as I chatted with my colleagues. His anger intensified as he marched towards me. Don't ignore me. I'm the department head. We don't need someone like you. Get out now. Oh my, this isn't very calm. Mr. Johnson emerged from his office, hearing Michael's shouts. Michael demanded an explanation from him. What's going on? What about his responsibility for the client incident? You haven't reversed his firing, have you? Michael continued to shout angrily at Mr. Johnson. We all watched, more nervous than him. You don't have the authority to fire an employee, and wasn't it you who messed up the contract? Mr. Johnson spoke calmly, halting Michael's momentum. Silent and head down, Michael began to tremble. I don't understand what you mean. I didn't do anything. I'm not involved. Still trying to deny it at this point. His audacity was impressive, but not enviable. He desperately didn't want to admit his fault. As Michael denied it, I wondered what Mr. Johnson would say. Then, surprisingly, another employee spoke up. That contract was made by Michael, I'm sure. To my surprise, one of the employees started to testify. Leading the way, other employees also started testifying. I heard Michael ordering the contract to be sent by email. I heard Michael trying to communicate with the client in French, which he couldn't speak properly. I heard it too. It was clear from the conversation that it wasn't going well at all. Michael was taken aback by the successive employee testimonies, but when he shouted, "Shut up!" everyone fell silent. It was remarkable how much disdain he had garnered as a professional, and it was questionable how someone like him could be a department head. I felt a newfound closeness to Mr. Johnson and considered asking him about it later. Michael, why don't you just accept it gracefully? You're making a bad situation worse. As I said this, Michael turned beet red with anger. It was nothing but a tantrum. And he kept insisting he was not at fault. But Mr. Johnson put an end to this blame-shifting plan. However, we have surveillance footage and computer data history that clearly show your involvement, so no matter what you say, you are fired. Struck by the final blow, he fell silent and froze for a moment. And then, Michael crumbled to his knees. Finally, he was quiet. He muttered in a low voice, sweating profusely, "This wasn't supposed to happen. You'll receive a formal notice later. Go home for today." Eventually, Michael gathered his things and left dejectedly. Thus, the matter was concluded. Afterwards, Michael was fired. It turned out Michael was a distant relative of Mr. Johnson, and Mr. Johnson had been asked to look after him because Michael couldn't hold down a job. Michael had been taking credit for others' work and got promoted to department head. Mr. Johnson admitted it was his responsibility for not seeing through it and expressed his need for self-reflection. Losing his job, Michael entered a self-destructive phase and resorted to gambling. Soon, he couldn't pay his rent and was evicted. In a panic, he found a job with a dormitory, but the shared bathroom and thin walls, with complaints about any noise, made it tough. As for me, I returned to work the next day. My colleague's welcome back gift was a pile of work, just as I expected. But now, I was happy to be busy again. When I was getting into the swing of things, Mr. Johnson came by and limited my overtime to 3 days a week. When I asked why, it seemed that my father had expressed concern, asking, "Aren't you making him work too much overtime?" I was a bit dismayed to have my father involved at this age, but I knew he was concerned about me. With reduced overtime, I started visiting my parents more often. My mother and brother, worried about the recent events, treated me as if nothing had happened, which I greatly appreciated. Later, I learned that my mother was childhood friends with Mr. Johnson. She had wanted to complain to him about the overtime and the recent incident, but my father had calmed her down. My brother had been fired up about taking action against Michael, but again, my father had intervened. This whole situation made me realize how many people were on my side, making me feel fortunate, though maybe a bit overprotective. Later on, I became the training supervisor for a newly hired female employee, which led to us starting a relationship. Another important person was added to my life. I now want to be someone who protects others, and that's how I'm living my life. It's warmer this way, isn't it? Our hands became intertwined in my pocket. I had never even held a woman's hand before, and panicked terribly. "Hey, Emily, what are you doing?" As I hurriedly tried to pull my hand away, she gripped it tighter and said with a smile, "I've decided not to hide it anymore. My name is Michael, and I'm 31 years old. Right now, I'm reluctantly putting on a shirt I don't usually wear for a high school reunion, sighing in front of the mirror, thinking, I don't want to go, maybe I should skip it." Suddenly, my phone rings. Annoyed, I answer it, and the woman on the other end immediately says, "Are you ready? Have you left your house yet? Don't tell me you're still hesitating in front of the mirror because you don't want to go." She guessed my situation exactly. There's no way that's the case. I hastily moved away from the mirror. "Then hurry up and go, right now." Her shrill voice spurred me on, and I grabbed my bag and rushed out the door. Today is the high school reunion. Normally, I make up excuses not to go, but the woman I just spoke with on the phone insisted I attend, so I reluctantly agreed. Although I understand the reasons for going, my emotions are different, and my steps are heavy. As I walk slowly towards the reunion venue, a man brusquely passes by me. He stops at the traffic light ahead. Then, glancing at me, he exclaims, "Michael, is that you, Michael?" and approaches me. The first person I run into is someone I'd rather not meet. "It's me, John, remember, long time no see." The man talking to me without regard for my frowning face was the popular guy in high school, John, always at the center of things. Tall, handsome, popular, he was always enthusiastic during school festivals and sports days, lifting everyone's spirits. John now walks beside me, matching my pace. "You finally made it. All my invitations finally paid off. I thought you'd never come. You were always so quiet in high school, always reading books." Labeled as a quiet kid. Indeed, I was always reading books outside of class. I loved historical books. But what he might not realize, since meeting John, I haven't said a word. Despite my silence, he keeps talking. What mental strength he must have. I've just been quietly observing John. Am I the only one talking? "How have you been?" "Been well." Finally, he seems to notice my silence. I give her a smile and reply, "I've been fine." John laughs at my response. "You don't look fine at all. What are you working as?" "I'm in securities now. Suits me, right? What about you? You must be doing some dull job. Want me to refer you somewhere? I have a few connections." Again, he rambles on without giving me a chance to speak. "No need to worry about me," I reply, and John looks at me with pity. Are you really okay? You seem to be struggling." Saying this, he looks down at my feet. Puzzled, I look down and see my familiar sandals in my field of vision. In my haste, it seems I left the house in my usual sandals instead of the leather shoes I had prepared. I lose all motivation to attend the reunion. as I was thinking about going back home. Suddenly, John pulled my arm. I was led into an alleyway between buildings. "What's this all of a sudden?" To my protest, John placed his index finger to his lips and whispered, "Shh, there's a really beautiful woman over there." I felt deflated at John's words. "So what?" I replied without even looking in that direction. "She seems to be waiting for someone. Keeps looking around. Maybe I should go talk to her." John, with a gleam in his eye, was peeking towards the street. "Do whatever you want, but why do I have to hide with you?" As I was grumbling to myself, John said, "I'm going to talk to her. Watch my courage. I'll impress her with my Chinese." With that, he left me in the alleyway and darted off. Chinese. The beautiful woman must be a foreigner. With a bad feeling, I stealthily peeked towards where John had gone. Just as I thought. I leaned against the building, holding my head. "Hey," I heard John's voice, speaking Chinese to the woman. I couldn't hear the woman's voice. Probably, she was ignoring him. Then, John started to babble something in Chinese. From the words I could catch, he seemed to be bragging about his job and asking for her contact information. After a while, I heard the woman's exasperated voice. "Can you please stop with that annoying bad accented Chinese? I can speak English." Her assertive voice echoed, and John was momentarily silenced. But he didn't back down. "Wow, your English is great. Awesome. Hey, why don't we go on a date? Just once. I earn a good salary, so I can take you anywhere you like. Even to places like San Francisco or Las Vegas." John switched to English and confidently continued his flirtation. The woman sharply replied, "I'm waiting for someone." But John persisted. "Is that a man? A woman? Do you have a boyfriend? It's rare to find a guy better looking and earning more than me. Why don't you give me a chance?" Interrupting John's words, the woman declared, "I have someone I really love. There's no one better than him, and of course, you are out of the question." Her piercing words left John stuttering. "Who is he? There can't be such a guy." He was clearly shaken. I was shaken too. I hadn't thought she had someone like that. Then, the sound of heels approached. And then, "It's this guy." Suddenly, my wrist was grabbed and I was pulled out of the alley. John looked stunned. My face must have looked even more foolish. "Huh?" As I uttered a silly sound, Emily, the Chinese woman, frowned at me. Even with that expression, she was incredibly beautiful. Her shimmering black hair was glossy, her eyes, dark and exotic. Her skin was pale, and the freckles added a mature yet youthful look to her face. Her high nose bridge and full, attractive lips were striking. From those lips came an angry voice. "Why the sandals, Mr. Anderson?" Her high-pitched voice pierced my ears. "It's because of Emily. She rushed me to leave quickly. The person I had been on the phone with when I left was Emily." My defense was futile as she retorted, "That's why I kept telling you to put the sandals in the shoe cabinet. I knew you'd end up wearing them by mistake, and see, it happened just like I said." Speechless, I clammed up. Emily sighed and pulled something out of a paper bag, thrusting it at me. "Leather shoes." As I muttered, she raised her high nose even higher and said, "I thought this might happen, so I bought these. I'm glad I came to check if you were actually coming. On the way here, the thought of you in sandals crossed my mind. I thought it wouldn't hurt to buy a pair of dress shoes, just in case. I'm an excellent editor, aren't I?" Seeing her satisfied smile, I humbled myself. "You're the best editor in the world. Thank you." I took the shoes and changed out of my sandals. John, who had been watching the whole scene dumbfounded, finally spoke. "Wait, you know each other, and your favorite person is Michael. What's going on?" He was full of questions, with imaginary question marks floating above his head. Emily answered proudly. Mr. Anderson is a rising best-selling author, and I'm his editor. As for my favorite person, that's irrelevant right now, isn't it? Even John seemed taken aback by her unwavering smile. I let out a sigh. Wait a minute. I'm not really a best-selling author or anything. As I started to speak, Emily cut in. Stop downplaying yourself. Please focus on the interview. That's right, the reason I came to the reunion. It was. I am rather plain and have a hard time imagining a protagonist with a cheerful personality. My characters always turn out gloomy and unremarkable, so I came to interview people who had a bright and fulfilling high school life. John was the perfect candidate. So, I asked him directly. So, John, would you mind if I interviewed you? John chuckled at my straightforward request. What, am I just a stepping stone for you? Wait, you're an author now, writing novels. Now it was my turn to chuckle. Well, I write under a different name, both children's books and novels. I'd like to write historical fiction, but I'm lacking in that area. So I've been writing young adult novels. Emily here is pretty demanding, I said, glancing at Emily with a frown. Emily, 7 years younger and my new editor at a publishing company, pointed out my slump in historical fiction. Mr. Anderson. Heartwarming stories suit you better. How about a young adult novel, something a bit touching? She insisted. This made me resist her suggestion. I could handle short stories like children's books, but I couldn't write long, tear-jerking narratives. However, Emily, with her direct gaze, convinced me. You can do it, Mr. Anderson. It's perfect for you. Please trust me and try this direction for your next book, please, she pleaded. The young adult novel we reluctantly collaborated on. About a plain guy like me who becomes a runner in a district relay race and experiences family bonds, friendship, and a little romance. Turned out to be a moderate hit. As Emily and I worked together, my writing flowed more smoothly, and the story developed effortlessly. It became my best-selling book and remains my most well-known work. Still, I yearn to write historical fiction. Whenever the topic of my next book comes up, I always suggest it. But Emily's response is always hesitant if it's about a modern-day high schooler encountering a historical figure back from the dead. Then maybe I'll consider it. Hearing this, John looked utterly amazed. Wow, I don't read novels much, so I didn't know, but if it's that amazing, I may give it a try, John said, and I hastily shook my head. Don't read it. You really don't have to. John burst into laughter at my panicked reaction. Don't be so against it, but I get it. A plain guy as a protagonist. That means it's about you, right? I blushed deeply. The foundation of that story was entirely a product of my experiences mixed with my imagination. One time I was forced to participate in a district marathon because my mother was one of the organizers, and it was a complete disaster. But in the novel, I altered the outcome. The friendship depicted was merely a figment of my imagination. A plain guy who always buried himself in books and romance. That was even more of a fantasy, a distant world for me. The thought of my high school classmates reading that book and recalling me sent shivers down my spine. After a good laugh, John said, Okay, I won't ask for the title. I can probably find it if I search, but hey. A little teasing like this is fine, right? Being on good terms with such a stunning beauty, I'm jealous. I have completely forgotten because of the scandal incident, but come to think of it, didn't Emily call me her favorite person? The realization made my head spin, and I was no longer in the right state of mind for interviews or the reunion. Since I couldn't focus, I decided to record the interview content. After about 2 hours, when the reunion ended and I left the venue, Emily was waiting outside. Her cheeks were flushed. In the winter season. How long had she been waiting? I rushed over to Emily. You didn't have to wait. I handed her a hand warmer from my pocket. It was still slightly warm. She took it and showed a smile. "It's warm, thank you, but..." Then, she forcefully slid her hand into my pocket and intertwined it with mine. "It's warmer this way, isn't it?" Our hands became intertwined in my pocket. I had never even held a woman's hand before and panicked terribly. "Hey, Emily, what are you doing?" As I tried to pull my hand away in a hurry, she gripped it tighter and said with a smile, "I've decided not to hide it anymore." She leaned closer to me. "Were you thinking about me these past 2 hours?" Feeling the warmth from where she touched me, my body heated up. It was a completely different atmosphere from usual. "Shall we go somewhere, preferably somewhere we can be alone?" Hearing this, my mind nearly short-circuited. Eventually, we headed to my apartment, my workspace. Emily said she had a somewhat sensitive matter to discuss. Since it's also my workplace, Emily, being my editor, frequently comes in and out. Trying to stay calm in a situation where we were alone, my heart wouldn't stop racing. Emily, familiar with my kitchen, made tea and sat across from me. I looked down at my tea, waiting for Emily to speak. "Mr. Anderson, were you surprised about me liking you?" Her casual mention of liking made my heart race. "Really? Is it true? Not just a lie to get rid of John?" I asked, and Emily's expression turned serious. "It's really true. I decided to become an editor here because of you, Mr. Anderson. I studied English really hard for that." Emily's English was indeed fluent. She wouldn't have become an editor in America otherwise. "The reason is me." "What do you mean by that?" I struggled to grasp her meaning. Then, Emily took out a picture book from her large bag, handling it carefully. Seeing the book, I was astonished. It was my first published picture book. A little boy, angel in the sky, chooses which parents to be born to. The parents he chooses eventually start to argue and drift apart. Born to be the child of a couple who once seemed happy, the boy makes a decision one day. To bring smiles back to his parents' faces, he decides, "I will be the light of happiness in our home," and tries to never lose his smile. He decorates the house with beautiful pictures, flowers he finds on the roadside, and cutesy shells from the beach. Little by little, lights of happiness begin to shine in the home. These lights eventually reach the mother, then the father, and finally, they bring back the smiles of both parents. This picture book was the first work I ever submitted to a publishing house, and luckily, it won a prize and was published. Afterwards, the picture book didn't do too well, so I shifted to writing novels. But it's a work that holds a lot of sentimental value for me. I first became interested in America because I heard that the American people are friendly and the cities are well maintained. Emily began, looking fondly at the slightly worn picture book. "My parents had a bad relationship when I was about 13, constantly fighting. Besides, the house was always a mess. I wanted to escape to a world that was friendly and free of clutter. I just wanted to get away from that house." I listened to Emily's story with a solemn expression, feeling a sharp twinge deep in my heart. One day, I thought, I should go to America. I should learn English, but just studying was boring. So, I decided to read stories. I've always loved reading since I was a child. Then, she searched the internet for books in simple English. Thinking picture books would be written in easy language, she checked the contents of several. Among them, she came across my picture book. I didn't quite understand it, but I was drawn to it. Even before fully understanding the content, I thought, this is it. She was surprised when she read the book she had ordered. I felt strongly, this angel boy is me. I was born to be happy, yet not happy. Did I do anything to become happy? No, I just disliked the status quo. Like the boy in the book, I decided to increase my smiles one by one. Despite her parents' moodiness, she kept smiling. She gave her father birthday presents and cleaned the house when her mother didn't. The cleaned house felt refreshing, like little lights of happiness were being lit. Patiently, she continued to light these small lights, untangling each tangled thread, one by one. And the result? I hesitantly asked, and she looked down, taking out her phone. She then showed me the screen with a smile. There was a lovely photo of Emily, smiling closely with a middle-aged couple at what seemed to be an airport. It worked out. Emily nodded with a broad smile. It was tough, especially at the beginning, but now, my parents are really close. They even apologized to me. They remembered that they loved each other and got married. Really, it's all thanks to this picture book. As she finished speaking, she looked at me in surprise. I was crying. "Mr. Anderson, what's wrong? Did I say something bad?" I wiped my tears and shook my head. It's me." As I strained to speak, Emily asked softly, "What is it?" "It's just that angel protagonist is me from my high school days." My voice was choked as I spoke, and I sensed Emily's surprise. My parents got along fairly well, I think. My father was busy with work, a bit strict, but he made a great effort to spend time with the family on his rare days off. My mother was a homemaker, always supporting my father with a smile. Their relationship soured after my father had an affair. It was a brief, frivolous relationship, but my mother's intuition was sharp, and she soon found out. My father became defensive, and my mother chose not to divorce for the sake of our living. Since then, it's been like a silent separation in our house. That family in the book is mine. The reconciliation, just a dream of mine. The last scene of the book shows a happy family of 3 enjoying an amusement park. My childhood memories of going to an amusement park are still vividly joyful. But my family never got along. It's been nearly 10 years since I left home. My parents still continue their cold relationship. They could have divorced, and there were some ways to make a living. But my mother is not the type to take action. My father, whether he understands my mother's feelings or not, does no household chores and is still working. I haven't returned home for years, and my parents haven't asked me to come back. I wrote that book, but I never really put in any effort. It was just a wish, splattered onto the manuscript, but I'm glad. I wiped my tears and managed a thin smile. Someone was saved by looking at that picture book. Unlike me, a child who actually made an effort. Thank you, Emily, for telling me that my book had a meaning. As I took Emily's hand to express my gratitude, she smiled. I should be the one thanking you. That picture book held my family together and gave me a big goal to pursue. As I gazed at Emily, she formed a smile. I became determined to be involved in the work of the person who wrote that book. It gave me so much motivation. I applied to the publishing house that published most of Mr. Anderson's works and passionately talked about him during my interview, and then the first offer they assigned me to was Mr. Anderson. I'm so lucky. The people at the publishing house are really kind. Emily said this with a full smile, but the truth was probably different. I was probably a difficult author for the publishing house to handle. I'm reserved, without significant accomplishments. Despite not having great ideas, I'm fixated on historical fiction. That picture book was just something I wrote as a break from writing historical novels when I was in high school, using my own family as a model. It was a decent piece, so I just happened to submit it to a contest. Then I became an author who wasn't doing well. For someone who eagerly wanted to be my editor, the publishing house must have been thrilled. As I gave her a smile, Emily smiled back. Any path is fine. I'm happy to be Mr. Anderson's editor now, and to be able to create works with him. My dream has come true. Emily genuinely smiled, satisfied. I'm greedy, so I have another dream now. Emily looked straight at me and said, "I want to become the angel boy for Mr. Anderson's parents." Her black eyes sparkled as she spoke. "Mr. Anderson, your father and your mother, I want to rekindle the bond between the three of you, and of course, I want to do that as your wife." I was taken aback by her words. "I can do it. I'll light up each lamp in Mr. Anderson's family home." So, Emily leaned in close to me. "Make me your wife, Mr. Anderson." I was almost swayed by her cuteness. "But, Emily, you've made so much effort. Reconciling your parents, mastering English, getting into an English publishing company, and compared to you, I've made no effort. Not with my parents, not with my writing. I can't stand proudly beside you unless I make an effort in something." As I spoke earnestly, Emily looked surprised. "Mr. Anderson, you are making an effort." Confused, I looked at her, and she smiled. "I know you've been visiting museums and ordering difficult materials to write historical fiction. That was something I didn't want to be known." Embarrassed, I blushed deeply. "And your novels afterwards?" My heart skipped a beat. "They always referred to your childhood stories. I thought you had a wonderful childhood, but it was different. Those were the lights you wanted to bring to your own family." Hearing this, I couldn't help but tear up again. "And really, a child doesn't have to work so hard. Just the fact that you want to try is admirable." Emily gently hugged me. "You'll make me your wife, right?" I nodded repeatedly in her embrace. I felt pathetic, crying in the arms of someone 7 years younger. As I confessed this, she confidently said, "I'll take so much care of you," and I just melted. Later, I properly confessed to Emily. That day had been too one-sided. Dressed in her favorite suits, I was on my knee before her. "I love your earnest efforts. I will protect you for a lifetime. Please marry me." Emily was moved to tears and immediately wanted to meet my parents. "Right now." Surprised by my reaction, Emily said with a wink, "Strike while the iron is hot, right?" Eventually, we went straight to my parents' house, 2 hours away, bringing a foreign beauty home so suddenly. My parents were shocked. But Emily quickly won their hearts. Before we knew it, she had created a group chat with my parents. Emily sent pictures of small moments of happiness to the group every day. The color of the clear sky, a contentedly sleeping cat, a single resilient flower blooming through a crack in the asphalt, and a tiny sprout peeking out from a planter. Each photo was like lighting a small lamp, and my parents would reply with small messages, to which Emily and I would respond. Gradually, those connected lights began to shine brighter. Years later, "Who wants to go to Grandpa and Grandma's house?" Emily asked, and our 2 children responded with excitement. Our son wanted to play soccer with Grandpa, and our daughter was eager to cook with Grandma. Even I felt my spirits lift. The lights Emily persistently lit now brightly illuminate my family home. The house, once filled with the cold air of a silent separation, now warmly welcomes us, with my parents greeting us with smiles. Lately, my father even sometimes cooks for us. He's been learning to cook, taking lessons from my mother. Who could have imagined such a scene? Yet, this was exactly the scenario I had dreamed of. "Thank you, Emily," I said. She shook her head with a smile. "It's only because you didn't give up, Michael, that I didn't either." Her radiant smile made me smile too. Sure, we might argue sometimes, but we always want to continue lighting those small lamps of happiness.